Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel, and today I'm just going to be talking about the books that I've been reading this week, and it's been a fun set of sort of weird and wonderful things, so let's get started talking a little bit about them, and I hope you've all been having a good week. First up, as part of my reading for the Goldsmiths Prize, I read The Long Form by Kate Briggs, and this is just a weird and wonderful book in many ways. So the core idea of this is that this is ostensibly a novel about a woman who's recently had a child and is trying to navigate what it means to be a mother. That's the very basic version of what this book is, but it does far more and explores far more other sort of avenues. So essentially what starts to happen quite early on is she starts to question not only notions of what a novel is, but also starts to expand some of the ways we think about power, and we talk about language and various other things all kind of bound up in it. So she starts with talking about a kind of a sort of square of sort of play area that this child is using, and starts to use that as sort of this way of bridging a metaphor about pushing beyond these sorts of spaces and what have you. And whereas all of that sounds incredibly pretentious and academic as I'm explaining it there, it actually comes off surprisingly fluidly, I think, in this book. It's worth noting that the author herself translated various sort of bits of philosophy and sort of political thought. And so some of those ideas actually come up in this book in a really interesting way. For example, the mother starts to read Tom Jones by Henry Fielding, and in so doing starts talking about finding pockets of time to read a book, and what that how those bits of time of reading a book are very different to the regular day-to-day time, which are also by themselves very different from how time passes when you're looking after a child, not only because of their own development and speed of development, but also because you can spend a whole day with a child and it feels like 4 years, or you can spend a whole day with a child and it might feel like a couple of minutes. So she talks a lot about time and these sorts of concepts around it. She then starts to have these sort of weird and wonderful passages where she almost imagines herself existing within things that are sort of anachronistic. So there is a lecture happening on the role of the novel and what makes and constitutes a novel. And it's worth noting that Tom Jones as well is a fairly formally inventive novel as well. So all of these sorts of thoughts are happening about what really constitutes a story or linear time or linear thought or whatever. And then in that lecture, she just appears as a guest or sort of in the audience carrying her baby. And she questions some of the ideas that are being said in this lecture by a man, essentially saying, actually, look, myself as a mother, there are things around time and the breaking of narratives that you don't understand. But that itself is breaking a narrative and breaking a time structure and breaking, you know, and is sort of acting anachronistically. So it's just this really interesting thought experiment happening that also sort of happens to be a novel. And I kind of love how this book keeps on almost poking fun at itself. It's sort of aware that it's a novel, writing a novel. And actually it's interesting because the author's other work, which I've not read yet, she has an essay on translation and language, but that also apparently reads sort of like an essay and a novel at the same time. So this is a sort of really fun, playful experiment, I think, in sort of how creative the form of a novel can be. And it makes total sense that this exists within the Goldsmiths Prize shortlist, which is a prize all about sort of formally inventive bits of writing. Next, I won't touch on these in a great amount of depth, but I'll sort of cover them a little bit separately, a little bit here because I have a separate video on them. But essentially, a sort of a project I've been doing for a few years has been to read other books by the authors shortlisted for the Booker Prize each year. Because, you know, I needed more reading projects in my life. And so 2 that I read this week were Paul Lynch's Grace and Sarah Bernstein's The Coming Bad Days. And I'll just very quickly wrap them both up here. But Paul Lynch's Grace is a sort of, like Prophet Song, a very intense novel that really focuses on the sort of brutality, particularly around this certain character, Grace. And she is almost this sort of distant figure for most of the book. People are often sort of observing her and sort of talking about her. And we sort of follow a lot of kind of more formally experimental bits, but particularly the sort of playfulness of language. So Paul Lynch often creates new words, or he sort of plays around with how a sentence might be, or it will be very colloquial and then suddenly very formal. He sort of plays around a lot with language and what it does. So I enjoyed it overall, even if it is an incredibly intense read, like Prophet Song, and kind of, you know, this is not sort of a nice, fun beach read on your holiday, but really interesting in its own way nonetheless. And then Sarah Bernstein's The Coming Bad Days. So this is her debut, and it sort of similarly, like Study for Obedience, similarly focuses on a slightly detached character, a character who sort of slightly out of loop with the rest of the world. She picks and chooses things. She sort of leaves, or tries to sort of leave a sort of relationship, and sort of leaves town and all these other things. And it sort of exists in this very complicated space. And she also kind of within that just sort of really starts thinking about these sort of other relationships with men, or at one point with a woman who she grows close to. And there are these sorts of, there's just this intensity to the way she exists in the world that makes her kind of maddening as a character sometimes, but makes for really interesting reading nonetheless. So I really greatly enjoyed this. And yeah, I think it's always fun reading other books by shortlisted authors, because quite often you sort of find these little gems that, you know, I hadn't heard of Sarah Bernstein until the long list. And I'm really glad now I've read 2 books by her that I've really enjoyed. So those sorts of things can come up really quite nicely from things like that as well. Next up, in some ways on a similar note to the Sarah Bernstein book, The Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri, Lahiri. And she is an author who I hadn't read but kind of kept on meaning to read. She's won a Pulitzer before. This book itself was shortlisted for the Booker in 2013, and she is just one of those writers who I keep on meaning to read. And The Lowland I found really interesting in so many ways. So it largely focuses around sort of some of the political struggles of the 60s and 70s and 80s. It in some ways has a less US focused lens, because a lot of this is focused on India and some of the other sort of South Asian and Southeast Asian countries nearby, where sort of political uprisings are happening. But there's also this sort of uprising in our main character, who the sort of central woman in the book, at one point is sort of talking about leaving her child and leaving her partner, leaving her family, leaving almost everything to sort of contribute in some ways to the cause. And the cause might require her to go and do a PhD and go and focus on things elsewhere for her to feel that she's being useful. But equally, there's a sort of powerlessness that affects most of the characters in the book with these big sort of political uprisings. There's an excitement that they can be part of something bigger, but there's also something that drags them back and makes them feel quite powerless in the grand scope of things. What do they do that can really add impact? Does your domestic day-to-day life work like radical praxis, or is there something else you should be doing instead? And these kind of conversations really permeate so much of this book. I think I found it just really interesting in several ways, just how she's able to construct some of these narratives and write in this very forceful and sort of determined way. There's a sort of control in the narrative that I found really engaging, as I did with another book by her that I read this week, which is Roman Stories. So this is a collection of short stories, although they almost operate in a novel-like way at some point, but they are separate in many ways. And it's a set of characters, particularly focusing on Rome as the main sort of portion of this. But I think, although not all the stories worked for me, I think that there was something really well observed about so many of them. I've never been to Rome, but the observations about certain things that I could relate to. So, for example, she at one point talks about expat communities in Rome, And she talks about the whole process of living somewhere else. And I lived abroad for a few years, and the thing that I felt like she really well captured is just the way that people have different relationships to cities and to places. So, for example, myself as a Londoner, whenever somebody comes to visit London, as actually happened this week, I get to show them around and I get to sort of do the thing. And you realise that there are so many big things that you walk past all the time, like Big Ben or whatever, and you don't really sit and think about how impressive that might look to somebody who doesn't live here. I'm used to seeing it a lot, so it doesn't feel as special. It's only when you step back that you notice that. But she then also talks about how other people then have this more intimate history, seemingly from the outside, with your place than you do. So they love all the galleries, they love all the shops, they love telling you facts about your own country, they love, you know, all these sorts of things, and you might not know them, or you might have forgotten that and you were taught it in school. And so I think she very astutely observes those sorts of connections. So she at one point gives this example of expats coming to Rome, telling Italians about, you know, the dates that certain emperors were around or who followed whom, and telling you all these facts, and then like traveling every weekend to every corner of the country in a way that you might not necessarily do, because you think, oh, it's Saturday, I'm going to see my friends, I might do some laundry. And actually, when you're living somewhere else, there's a real kind of urgency that comes up. And this happened when I lived abroad, where I'd often spend a lot of my weekends going and trying to explore new places, where if I lived there and was a native there, I probably wouldn't be quite as fussed. So but then equally, those people then leave after a few years and have this you know, they don't notice the sort of small changes. They like the new, they like the exciting. But those new and exciting things for a local can feel quite disturbing, because it means that something's being changed fundamentally, for better or for worse. So I think she really cleverly observes some of those things and the kinds of relationships that engenders. So the fact that can kind of create these very temporary transactional friendships, and it can do all these other bits as well, which I just thought was a really interesting set of observations. So I think, yeah, it's a mixed collection, I think, in that sense sometimes for me. There's some really, really standout ones, and some other ones that I just thought were nice and interesting. But regardless, I think she's a really focused and interesting writer. Next up, I read Ilya Kaminsky's Deaf Republic, which is a set of poems, but they sort of read like one kind of continuous narrative. And particularly, he himself is a Ukrainian, and he talks a lot about sort of Ukrainian resistance in this book. This was this was a few years ago, before the more recent invasion, but he talks here about these sorts of characters, and he himself being sort of hearing impaired, he kind of makes these connections between a kind of a deafness that is a sort of, you know, an actual sort of physical disability of deafness, and a kind of cultural deafness where people, or a kind of collective deafness where people miss things, or don't notice things, or allow things to happen around them because they don't really want to confront what the realer thing perhaps is, which actually made me think a lot about Jose Saramago's blindness, which almost plays with that same idea in a slightly different way. So I thought this was really interesting how he explores that. And the book itself, you know, will have these poems, and particularly this sort of set of villagers who are either trying to resist or trying to kind of get through the day. But it also is coupled with bits of sign language to kind of go with this idea of the kind of collective deafness. And these characters almost create their own signs that are related to various problems or challenges and things around them. So I just found this a really interesting book, because it sort of defies a lot of typical things. It's sort of a poetry collection, but these poems, as much as they can be standalone, work as this one big sort of meta-narrative about this kind of set of people. It's got physical signs written into a book. It just is doing quite a lot of really interesting things all at once. So yeah, I'm really glad I finally got around to reading this. And last but not least, I read Falling Animals by Sheila Armstrong. And so this is a book that starts with this sort of central idea of there's just a man who people can see on the beach, and he's sort of just there, and it's a sort of mysterious set of circumstances. And the rest of the book is basically different narratives of people trying to understand why he's there, how he came to be there. And it starts to sort of blur in this really odd sense where some of these things feel a bit imagined and unreal. Some of these things feel like there's something else hiding more deeply behind them. Some of these stories are seem to be really revealing a lot of the biggest sort of secrets, and others are sort of about the feel of all of this. And so these sort of voices overlap into this quite disarming story. It's quite a bold debut in that sense, that it just has this voice of characters trying to sort of solve something that the reader doesn't really have an insight into. We sort of just know that these things are happening, and it's kind of this odd mystery that's just sort of left hanging in many ways. So yeah, just a really wonderfully bizarre book, but there's a real force to the writing that I found very engaging. There's a sort of propulsiveness to how this narrative is structured. So even though we're hearing so many different voices and we're told how these characters' lives interact, it doesn't feel like this super intense kind of cacophony of voices. It kind of has a sort of clarity to it that I found really engaging. So yeah, interesting nonetheless. But regardless, all of those have been the books that I've been reading this week. I hope you've been having a good week. I hope reading's going well for you, and yeah, I hope as we get nearer and nearer to Christmas and to the winter holidays, I hope everyone's hanging in there all right. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.